That's frightening anybody? Kim, can you go smack him in the back of the head? Okay. All right. So, as we know, it's been an interesting couple of weeks. The snowstorm last week, I blame Mr. Wessels for, and the power loss that came from it. And then the fact that after the snowstorm, 2 hours later, I had sunny skies out. It was the most bizarre day, but we had no power. So we've lost a couple weeks, and we're going to work on a plan to try to catch back up. So last week, we were going to do Cyber Siege, which is kind of an interesting, it's a video game, but it's actually developed by the Department of Defense, and it, in theory, will teach us quite a bit about security. So we're going to reintroduce it, but we'll probably do that after the break. So we'll try to catch up. We'll stretch our brains a little bit. Then we'll have a break. Take a week off. Everybody's going to go somewhere sunny, I'm assuming. And then we're going to come back again. So I'm going to pull down my schedule here so you should be able to see this now. So on week 6, when I look at it, week 6 was that Cyber Siege activity. So we're going to skip that for right now. Out of there. We're going to look at week 7. And so that material that ends this week, we're going to go ahead and read and discuss and look at. There is a quiz for week 7 for chapter 6 that I apparently couldn't spell quiz at some point. It cut off. That's interesting. The qui for chapter 6. And I will pull the due date on that until Sunday, or just eliminate the due date entirely. So make life a little easier.
What about the quiz that
There was not a quiz for week 6, because that was the Cyber Siege week. Week 5 had a quiz, and if I can go in and pull the dates on that, because I know it's been a little confusing with me flipping back and forth and closing cancels or closing the cast. So chapter 7 we're going to talk about. Chapter 7 is also the last chapter that includes material on next week's horrifying event. So there's a horrifying event next week. I probably broke it. So next week, I fixed one page and the other one didn't work now. Oh, goody. Great. So next week, we're going to have our midterm exam on Thursday. Next week. So on week 8, on Thursday, on Thursday. Now, it will be online, and so for the online students, it will be open, I believe we open it Thursday and Friday. It's not open all week. That way we can get our, I know. It will be, however, all essay, and it will, it's not that bad. Yeah, the cord's a little short. So we'll talk more about that as into Thursday and what's going to be on that. What I think we might do is, since it is available online, as a practical matter, we might actually explore Cyber Siege and create a video in class, and then allow you to do that at your own leisure anytime you'd like to then over the next couple of days. So it's not a horrifying event. It's just a midterm event to get us out of the way. It deals mostly with the book material. There'll be a few questions from other assignments. And if I pick the right one, so what we want to put together is a couple of models. Now, the quiz is a little more specific, pulls questions about some specific items. We're going to look at what there's some similarities and how we can look at this in terms of an overall framework. Because I don't expect you to memorize all these different types of models. but I want you to see the commonalities and what kind of things you're going to experience and why they're important for us to look at. So what we're really looking at is some kind of a management model. Well, for a lot of us, we're forced into management models that are already existing. So if we have federal government contracts, we have management models that we have to implement. Interesting. All right. So maybe I didn't fix computer services. All right. So, but we have some of these models that we're locked into that we don't have any way around. And so we might as well look at them and see where they came from and what kind of interesting things they're doing. So really we're looking at, the biggest model we're going to look at is something called a NIST model. So National Institute of Standards and Technology. The most common thing, you may have seen them before. Does anybody go online to get their time for their computer? Or have you ever heard of like the atomic clocks that go out and pull a radio signal and get an accurate time? That is a NIST. That's one of their many, many, many functions, including they work a lot with security, and they evaluate security products, they create frameworks. So if you've taken the networking class and you know what an active domain is, they even have domain policies that as a federal business or a contractor you have to subscribe to. You can do some of these freelance, but it really is a good idea to see what's out there in terms of available blueprints, what kind of things are out there, why we would implement them, best practices, and that way if you do run into an issue, you can simply look at what are other companies, what are other organizations doing. So you can do something called benchmarking, which even if you look at the NIST model, is not a bad idea to do. It gives you a what is our federal government doing? And is our federal government always very responsive? Sometimes because of the size of the bureaucracy, we lag behind on some incidents. So, and then it gives us the ability then to create what's called an access model. In other words, how do we deal with the users? What areas do we deal with them? How do we maintain their user rights? What about technology? So I could create a policy, and certainly that's part of the equation, that says, don't do this. Not too long ago, we actually had a policy that said in the library, you're not supposed to surf YouTube videos. How often did that get broken? Daily. So sometimes we have to create an exception, or we have to create a response, and we may need to use some kind of technology or a program. So maybe part of that program is a learning curve, and that says, this is the reason why we don't want you to go out to YouTube or a certain site. So that technology then would maybe be that firewall that actually blocks YouTube from going anywhere. No. We have a lot of terms. So any types of access control really has 4 points. So we want to attain the identity. So who needs access to this? So here on our campus, do students have different needs for access than faculty, than staff? Yes. So how do we confirm that it really is you? So when you log into Blackboard, how do I know it's really you? Okay, so a number and a password. So a one-factor authentication, literally, then. So hopefully you don't share that password with others. I hope. But one of the things that we're happening now is we're now seeing a lot of what we call two-factor authentications. How many of you log into a banking website and it makes you also memorize like an image or put in a, your mother's name or something strange? So another way to confirm that that really is you And so there's new methods coming out. You're going to see more and more biometric things. And I think with our credit card debacle with Target, you're going to see even more requests for some way to match up a physical ID. So we do have credit cards that they could make, but it costs a little more, that actually have a fingerprint reader right on the card to authenticate that it really is you trying to use your credit card. So once we've identified who you are, so we know, hey, it's Kimberly, then we can determine what kind of things you're allowed to do. And so once you've logged into MyPSC, because we all go to the same login for MyPSC, right? And so my login allows me to look at my advisees and look at their grades. You don't get to go look at your buddy's grades, hopefully. So that authorization, who can do what. And then finally, the last piece, and kind of one of the most critical really, is the idea of authorization, or accountability, I'm sorry. About who do we have in what systems and how do we track what they've done. So we may also call that audit trails. We may call that our system logs. But it's some way that we can check and see who was in what system. So we did have an incident at our college / the university system with somebody getting access to the MyPSC system a couple years ago. But pretty quickly they could tell through those system logs what systems had been compromised, what areas they had been used in. So it's another thing in an accounting system. A lot of accounting systems use the idea of audit trails. Why would we need audit trails in an accounting system? How many times in the paper do we read about somebody embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars? Don't we want to try to stop that as much as possible? So that accountability then can show who's tried to change the general ledger, what changes were made. We base a lot of these rules then on what you can access with a couple of very simple rules, something called least privilege. So we try to give you the minimum amount of access necessary to perform your job. And it's not that we hate you, not that we don't trust you. And in fact, I want the least privilege I can get. Because then when something goes wrong, I don't get blamed for it. If I'm in the IT department, this is kind of hard to do. And some systems make it a little easier. But the reality is in that IT department, do those guys in the IT department, are they able to get into data that should be restricted from them in many cases? Oh. So sometimes we have to work on a system that, although they need access to change things, we need to restrict their use in there. And then we need to have this idea of separation of duties. And I know I jumped ahead there. So separation of duties gives us a tool to solve some issues. And the classic example of separation of duties is that of a payroll clerk. Do we let one person process every aspect of payroll every day of the year for years on end? Not a chance. And why would we not do that? So I'm the payroll clerk. I'll put myself in the bad light. I'm the payroll clerk. I just decided to make up a new name for me. So I'm now Dan Smith, and I made up a social security number, and I'm going to pay myself an extra $40,000 a year. If there's no separation of duties, that could go undetected for quite a while, and in fact it has in places. So one of the things that we often do is we split up payroll into multiple pieces. So one person does, for example, the time clock, one person does the actual writing of the checks. We split up accounts receivable, accounts payable, very similar. And one of the interesting ways we do this in a lot of companies is actually with time off. You're thinking, well, how is time off a separation of duties? So we've put John in charge of payroll. All of a sudden I walk in and I say, John, guess what? You've got about 6 weeks of vacation and you're going to take 2 weeks of it. In fact, I'll give you a couple extra bonus days. You're out of here for the next 3 weeks. No, get up, just right now, get up and go. And we bring in somebody who's cross-trained to do that very job. And hopefully those times will then be long enough that if John has been embezzling or something else, or check kiting or any of those kinds of things, that'll be caught up with and we can find that. So we want to have multiple people. It's a little harder for more people to do bad things. So we look at this idea of access control in a couple of ways. We want to deter people. We want to prevent issues. We want to find out who did, if anything does go wrong. We want to figure out some way to recover from it. So we can look at it in all of those different aspects. So, come back here. Go the right direction. So, we can look at it from that aspect. We can look at it based on the idea of how does it impact our organization? So management versus technical. Oh, okay. All right. So a third approach, we look at how are the controls applied? So are they discretionary? Are they mandatory? So sometimes it's as simple as, if we look at, for example, the technical side, maybe our deterrent is we give them a warning banner and say, hey, don't go to this website. Well, that's not hard to do. Maybe we use a login system. So a detective then, in other words, how do we find out what happened? If we look at that in terms of logs, intrusion detection systems, and then if we think there's a problem, how do we correct it? So some form of forensic procedure. We go in and take your computer and scan it, and we discover that Derek has been going to websites he shouldn't and downloading things he shouldn't. That gives us our forensic procedure. How do we recover from it? Well, we certainly don't want to hand over Derek's computer to another employee with that suspect material still on it. So we need some form of a backup procedure. So we make a forensic copy of that drive, put a new hard drive in, start over on that laptop, for example. Well, what other things are there? So compensating, in other words, that idea of how do we deal with things we know are going to happen. So things like key logging. How do I ensure that my data entry clerks are really doing data entry? Well, I can look at their ability, their keystrokes. So I can actually monitor keystrokes, numbers. And if you've worked in a call center, which is quite frankly somewhere close on the level of horrible next to the mall a day before Christmas, but unless somebody likes the mall a day before Christmas. Okay, just checking. Sydney was kind of like, a mall, really? No, I'm just making fun of you. She actually lives in a town where they sort of have a mall. So we can look at this as, how do we look at those into different areas? So if we link operational, the same type of things we may refer to in terms of fires. So a fire suppression system is a corrective method for a fire. How do we deal with that idea of disaster recovery? So we do have something called a MAC. Now, if you've been in the network class, we use all these acronyms over and over again, and they're different, just to make life miserable. So in network class, what did MAC stand for? I'm looking at John. No, it does not. It was media access. But, so we use some of these acronyms just to make life miserable when you see the same acronym over and over again. But in this scheme, we're looking at how do we control information. And even sometimes when we look at a MAC, we're talking about owners of the data even are restricted from that usage. So think about Google. What is Google's primary statement? They say, first, we're going to do no harm, right? That's one of their And they have access to a huge amount of data, don't they? But yet, in theory, they have limited access to that data, even though they technically own it. Okay. Well, think about, for example, we'll take John again, who has worked at a hospital where they have a lot of patient information. Even though he technically has control over that data, are you able to access all of that data? I would hope not, because some of that is protected information. The same way here at the school. Even the IT department here at the school, in theory, should not be able to access financial aid information. They can control the containers it's in, but not the actual information. So in other words, we try to break that data down and see where it needs to go. So the military has a breakdown of how they look at data, from all the way from unclassified or any available to anybody to top secret data. In other words, we restrict it to a very few people. Now, with the issue with Snowden, how has that worked for him so far? So there's been some issues with this. So how are we going to review and look at that data then in the future? So we compartmentalize. In other words, we try to make the data available to as few people as possible. But the reality is, in today's world, how easy is it once a copy's been made to stop it from being disseminated? So we do have to be aware of that. So we may have some kind of a security clearance structure, and we use something kind of like that here at the college, but we assign roles then to different people in different groups. So each person or each group or job group is assigned a role. So in other words, data analysts may get a role and they get access to a certain subset of data. Faculty get a role and they get assigned a subset of data. Administration, financial aid. So there's things that, for example, even though I said, I can get access to my advisees' grades, the only thing I have in their financial aid is if they've got a hold because they haven't paid a bill. I can see nothing else about their financial aid. I cannot see their social security number. And because of future and strange restrictions, I can no longer see even a birth year. So when I look at a student, I have no idea how old they are. When I look at Jonathan, he could be anywhere from 20 to 75 as a prospective student coming in. 73 and a half, all right. Well, I hope I have that much hair when I'm 70. I wish I had that much hair now. Before you start laughing over there, I'll catch that. So what that does then is gives us a subset of what we need to do. So sometimes it's as simple as everything, including things like a clean desk policy. So we're here at the college. Are there business offices that need a clean desk policy? Very possible. So that, for example, the financial aid office, which is one of the few places where we still have to utilize social security numbers. Admissions has a ton of information. Oh, that should not be, should it? Great. So should that scare you? I don't have my data in there as a student right now. So that happens quite a bit. You'll walk into an office, and in fact, sometimes that's a piece of social engineering when we try to find out how can we get in access to that system. Sometimes we don't have to because it's literally just looking at us right there. In fact, sometimes we don't need that information as much as we just need to pick up the papers that are literally laying there on the desk. So even things like locking of file cabinets. There are businesses that have huge amounts of information in unlocked file cabinets. Check blanks. Student data. So there are businesses that have gotten burned by the idea of how do we get rid of data? Well, we'll just throw it in the dumpster. So Here it would be a little strange. If you went outside and we saw, God, who do I want to pick on? Kimberly? Sure. So you go outside, you see Kimberly diving through the dumpster back behind our building. Well, I was a little nervous where we were going to go there. Well, I see you're out there every day diving in the dumpster, but you know. So the reality, though, is people have found huge amounts of information from those recycling dumpsters, etc. So what do we want to do? So here we contract a service called Paper Tiger, but quite frankly, it frightens me a little bit in some places that use things like Paper Tiger, because here then you say, well, this is all secure documents, and I can put it in a big hamper with a lock on the top. Well, what is going to stop somebody then from walking in the door as a plastic bin? It's in a plastic bin. From coming in there with a hand truck and saying, hey, I'm from Paper Tiger, I'm grabbing your refuse, and walking out the door. If people are so bold that they'll walk into the server closets and get access and take out server racks, what's going to stop them from this? So, but at least we have that idea of, we start to think about how do we get rid of that information. Well, it's not just paper, though. We also need to think about what happens when we get rid of our computers. So Derek's computer that we've now decided it was so horribly filthy with stuff that we need to get rid of the computer. What happens when we just throw it out on eBay? Somebody else could get that information on there. And in fact, I worked with many years ago with a little project where we were trying to get recycle computers for people who didn't have enough money to buy one. They could then get internet access. Because it's, quite frankly, there is a digital divide in the United States. Those who can get that access and who can't. So I had gotten some computers, actually, that were coming out of a casino. I thought, well, surely their IT departments wipe these computers. But let's just fire it up, just out of curiosity. Every piece of accounting information for a casino was sitting on one. That's how I got my new gun collection. Yeah. No, and unfortunately, not only was it sitting there, they didn't have the computer password protected. None of the files were encrypted. It was like, holy cow. So I took it back and I said, you know, you might want to think about this because I'm not going to do anything with it today, but I'm not going to say that if you've got this policy and you haven't been enforcing that, it's an issue. Now, sometimes we end up with unintended consequences to that. So as a state college now, we have to get rid of any computer we get rid of, we have to destroy the hard drive. Well, including the ones here in the lab. Is there anything on these lab computers that's really going to be useful to anybody? Probably not. But if we pull computers out of financial aid, is there information that could possibly, yeah. So getting rid of all these things becomes a little bit of an issue. So by assigning people to a role then, and we can do it internally with technology, we do it by lumping people together, it gives us that idea that people are assigned based on that role. So most of the time we assign based on the rules. Sometimes we have to make some exceptions. Sometimes we call those task-based. In other words, we put them to a particular assignment or job. So somebody may be in a hospital. They may have the role of a nurse, but because they're in a super user group, we may have to extend their job or their role out a little bit. So sometimes we give you the ability to control your own data. So we give you the ability to share resources, share your data, assuming that you know how to control that data. And we use the term peer-to-peer. And every time we use peer-to-peer, what does everybody think of? Napster and, okay, Napster was a long time ago. Gmule and some of the other the sharing sites. But the reality is in a business, we use the term peer-to-peer to share data a little differently. But it still can be a dangerous thing. So we have other ones, content-based. So what content it is. So one of the things that a lot of medical institutions have implemented, for example, is a filter, both inbound and outbound, that actually actually searches for information in emails and web pages that could be construed as patient or health information. We may have access to information that is on a time basis. So part of that may be, now here we allow students to enroll 24 hours a day, but if I'm a bank, there may be systems in that bank, so the teller computer, for example, may only operate from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. And then if things go on past that, we know that there's an issue, or we can shut that machine off. So we may be able to use time to limit some of our resources. So, the always fun sound of a Mac. So we have security architecture models. So there's a whole ton of them. There's a trusted base model. So we have a reference system, and we compare that to our model of data. So this one's kind of fallen out of the wayside, so we're going to go quickly through that. And by quickly go through that, we're going to skip that. So there is a model called ITSEC, and where you're rating data. So we're looking at security based on a very large model. So some of these ideas we're looking at here really are based on more Fortune 500 size companies. So, but we can certainly then evaluate, and so it uses something called a common criteria. So, how secure is a system? So, all the way from, we may have functionally tested it, all the way to formally verified. In other words, an outside entity has verified and has said, yes, this system is secure. So if I need something that's on the EAL7 side, we're much, much more expensive than something that's just been at thought. Well, we think it's going to be safe. Great. So there are businesses that require systems that are very, very secure and verified. So think about Cooper Nuclear, for example. We probably don't want to install Windows 8 on the operating system for the nuclear plant. Okay, click, slide, there we go. So there's a Paul LaBaldapal, I even hate ever trying to pronounce it, a confidentiality model. So, Bella Padula, yes, maybe. Probably still butchering it. So, no. So, this model is kind of interesting. So it essentially says that objects of similar security rights can transmit to objects of similar security rights. So if I have a confidential document or a confidential user, I can't transmit to a lower category user. And we use some ideas in this. So out at Cooper Nuclear, for example, they use something called a one-way diode, which kind of has the same idea, that information can flow in, but it can't flow back out. And that's kind of the same idea. So we look at objects in terms of what can we do with them. So a read, so if I need to read a document, read an object, only if my security setting is at or lower than that of the object. Okay. I can't write it unless I have a security setting higher than that. So in other words, it gives me a model that I can read information, but I can't change it. So we use something similar here. I can examine students' grades for every class they took, but I can't change those grades. Only a dean or higher can then change those grades, actually. So, So we have another integrity model. So again, we're looking at that change. What kind of things can we change? Once data was created, how do we allow it to be changed? We also think about our system being consistent. So again, it's another model. We have this access model that looks at objects, subjects, and rights. So we look at things in multiple sets. So an object can get a property, a subject can get a property, and rights can have properties. So if we look at it from this, we have a multitude of rights. We can create an object, create a subject, delete subjects and objects, read. So we can grant access, delete access, or transfer access rights. So one of the things we have to think about when we looked at is that of idea of inherited permissions. So once I grant somebody else rights to an object, they inherit all the permissions that I had. So if I had the ability to destroy that object or delete it, then they get the same rights from that. So again, this is kind of a modification of the same idea. Now we just specify a few more items in there. Go thing. But what I really want to look at, because I think what you're going to see is these are becoming more and more important, and it's a source for data and ideas, is that idea of what does our federal government already use? What else is out there internationally? So anything that's proprietary, so John and Alex School of whatever, their access control properties, that's proprietary. We'd have to pay them a huge sum of money. Whoa, oh, now we say money, all of a sudden we're all intrigued. The reality, though, is your taxes, and we all love paying taxes, those taxes have already done a lot of that work, and so they're in what's called the public domain. So they're already existing. We can utilize them at our convenience. They are updated, but perhaps there are some times when they don't update quite as quickly as we'd like. But one of the standards, and we've talked about ISO before, you've seen it in POM, for example. So the ISO also has management models for information security. So an ISO 9000 plant may have an ISO 2002 security policy. So it gives a common basis for internationals, corporations. So everything from risk management, information security, compliance, human resources, asset management. So it gives kind of a framework that we can use crossing international borders. And so then it's got, you probably have seen this before, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. Well, we use something very similar then in this particular methodology. Go. There we go. So the ISO models are kind of a conceptual framework, though. They have some interesting pieces, and they give you a framework to develop a security model, but they don't necessarily have specific details about do X to your computer that's running Windows XP. On the other hand, our federal government and NIST has all the details down to do X on computer Y. Sometimes there's a response lag, but there's millions and millions of dollars being poured into this. So they published something called this Computer Security Handbook online. It has everything from ethics all the way to multidisciplinary issues. It has to deal with accountability, has to do with reassessment, and it breaks it down into those three categories we looked at before: management, operational, and technical. And so I know I was kind of nerds in this class. Anybody in here not a nerd? John. You would have to lose the pocket protector. Derek's not a nerd. And Sydney is not a nerd. All right, so some of us are not nerds. So we're concerned with the management. Some of us are concerned with the technical. All of us should be concerned with that operational. But what this does is give us a very nice, tight framework, already pre-developed. Everything from how do we approach these principles? So, system owners should have security responsibilities outside their own organization. In other words, that idea of you're giving back and you don't want things that you've done to create issues for others. Security requires a comprehensive and integrated approach. In other words, we can't throw one idea out. It's got to be system-wide. It's got to be company-wide. Because as you've seen, it doesn't take much to compromise. So let's look at the NSA. Would we have thought the NSA was a very secure organization? And it literally took one person. And right or wrong, your feelings on that, I think it's made us aware of things that are going on inside of our own government. And all these great security plans they had went out the window. And so I would suspect that some of these things are going to get reassessed just by that. So, security should be periodically reassessed. Well, duh. But what I think is interesting is this idea that security is constrained by societal factors. So what do I mean by security could be constrained by societal factors? What in society could constrain our ability to make a secure environment? Money. What else might be? What if I said, you know, the only way to get into Peru State College and to go to one of my classes is you have to get a barcode tattooed on your forehead? So probably not going to happen. But there are businesses who have said to get into our secure rooms, you need to have an RFID chip inserted in your arm. And they would say, oh, there goes your $100,000 a year job. No, yeah, true. Maybe. I wish. So, societal factors. There's a lot of different things. And we sometimes have given up some of those rights, and I will say that sometimes we get a little paranoid, but look at the idea of cameras everywhere in our society now. 10 years ago, we didn't have cameras. Now they're virtually everywhere. So now that we've got facial recognition, and in fact, you can get facial recognition on Google Picasso, which is kind of creepy if you put your pictures in there. That becomes a little bit of an issue. So sometimes society and political issues also play a role in what we can and can't do. So you can actually pull all of these up. They're available on the web. These give us templates for security plans. So we can have methods for assessing, designing, implementing, and they go all the way down to those very, very detailed ideas of even what security policies to implement on your computer network. So, Revision 3 SP 800-53 gives a systems development lifecycle approach. So that is that entire waterfall approach then through beginning to end, from assessment all the way to remediation if there is an issue. So the one we're going to focus on here is something called COBIT. And we might have seen COBIT if you've been in an accounting class and talked about Sarbanes-Oxley. So Sarbanes-Oxley says you must follow COBIT. So it's got a release in 2012. They're working on the next revision, and I'm guessing it's probably going to pop out in probably 2015. So in the meantime, there's updates and revisions, but the major releases aren't out yet. So it looks at this idea from stakeholder needs, wrapping the entire enterprise, and something called a holistic approach. So rather than a bunch of varied solutions, you look at it holistically. So the best example I have of holistic versus the Band-Aid approach is your doctor. How many of us go to the doctor to get a checkup and figure out how the best way we can plan for our future is? Or do we go to that doctor when we have an issue and they treat one symptom? How many of us don't go to the doctor at all? Yeah, they make you. So a holistic approach. So there are some doctors who say, if you want to be part of my practice, you're going to meet with me and we're going to create a holistic approach. So you're going to plan a diet and a nutrition and a health plan versus coming in just when you have strep throat. So we want our business to do kind of that same thing. A holistic plan, everything from how do we assess and how do we search for new issues, how do we make our employees happy, because happy employees tend to steal less data and do bad things. And one of the other things that I think is interesting, one of the frameworks of this is it takes away control from the management. So the management team can objectively then say, I don't have any choice in this. We need to implement X, Y, and Z. Now, hopefully they're on board with it anyway, but the reality is a lot of employees become very resentful. And if they realize that this is a framework that my boss doesn't really have anything to do with other than they're helping implement it, sometimes that can soothe those wounds of when you have to go through a gate and all different kinds of things. So one of the things we have to deal with is all these things like Sarbanes-Oxley. And so these gives us a framework to do that. And so you'll see that COSO then is mostly internal control processes. So again, that idea of how do I stop fraudulent activities? So how do I separate accounts receivable and accounts payroll? Why do I pull John out of payroll for 2 weeks? So that we can find those fraudulent activities. Why do we bring in external auditors to determine that, our state of Kansas, we really shouldn't be providing Kleenexes for the classrooms. So sometimes we have kind of those. So that COSO framework then, when we're talking mostly then about a financial piece, looks at those things from the idea of a control environment, what kind of risk, how do we control those activities, how do we continually monitor to make sure that those activities aren't taking place. Then we have the ITIL. So when we start talking more nuts and bolts, so very detailed about on the technical side then, we can get information from ITIL. Oh, come back here. Come back. Hit the scroll button. So what we're really looking at is a framework then, and they're available. So next week's assignment, and I'll try to post it and make sure it gets posted today, we're going to pull up part of that NIST framework, and you're going to get to examine pieces of it. Now, obviously not all of it, unless you want to read thousands and thousands of pages. Oh, you'd like to do that. Thanks, Alex. So we're going to pull that up, and so we're going to look at that in terms of what kind of framework's already out there. we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We may have to modify the wheel to fit our vehicle, but we can certainly then try to come up with a way to regulate our own business. And if we're a smaller business, we're not going to have 20 or 30 people to work on our security team. We're going to have one who maybe has an hour a week. How do we deal with those same issues? Because the same issues facing General Motors are going to be facing the local insurance agency in terms of how do I deal with that information, how do I deal with security, and how do I not lose my business. General Motors can survive probably. Maybe I shouldn't use General Motors since they already went bankrupt once, but a company the size of General Motors can withstand the loss of personal and secure data. A downtown business selling American Family Insurance may not survive that $100,000 lawsuit. Even as our state college system, the size of our policy for cybersecurity, I think, is only $10 million. If we lost every record in the state very quickly, could that lawsuit be far past $10 million? Yeah. Or if we lost credit card information? So if we think about Target, what's it going to cost Target at this point? So the estimates are anywhere up to $500 million or more. Think of the gun collection I could have if I had an extra $500 million. 8 motorcycles in one day. But then you'd have to make decisions about which one to ride, though. That would be hard. You'd have to hire people to decide. So what we're looking at is giving some kind of a framework. So this is the last chapter in the book that we're going to cover before a quick midterm. So next week, you'll look at the scheduling. You're going to see it's rearranged a little bit. And we're going to then do a quick review. We're going to look at some things. We're going to try to introduce you a little bit to Cyber Siege. And then when we come back from break, we're going to go back into Cyber Siege and look at it again, because I think it's a great tool. It'll give us a little bit of break from reading also. And we all like video games, right, Sydney? I hope. Okay, well, this video game will probably not be as exciting as some of the other ones you've seen. Yeah, it's... Do you remember the old Atari 2600s with the block? No, it's not that bad, but it is not Call of Duty 12 or whatever's recently out there. It's a little bit beyond that. So, yeah, kind of like Frogger for The Office. So we'll get to explore that a little bit. So we'll go over that on Thursday real quick on how to install that again, in case we had forgotten that. And then on Thursday, we're going to cover an additional chunk of material that you'll love. I mean it. I mean it. We're going to look at a couple of other tools that are available. Teach you how to hack Gmail accounts. That does not seem like a good plan.